So this isn't me jumping on the hate train of Kirk Hammett, but Justin Hombach made a video about Kirk Hammett and his sort of response to his past few singles with Metallica, specifically in his solos, of criticisms that he's gotten that he hasn't really done a whole lot that's interesting or more out there related to the more modern metal. And Justin kind of highlighted a lot of the really ridiculous things that Kirk said in the article in response to certain things, and you should really go watch his video because he highlights a lot of really good stuff. But towards the end of the video, Justin mentions a really interesting quote that Kirk said about certain scales in music theory, and Kirk saying that he knows these scales, but he just chooses not to use them. So we're asking the age-old question, does Kirk Hammett know music theory? I'm going to say a little bit, but probably not as much as you think, okay? And this might not be a surprise to some of you, but most of Kirk's solos, as we already know, is using the pentatonic scale or the natural minor scale. There is nothing wrong with that, okay? Let me be very clear. There is nothing wrong with that, but what he said in the article doesn't really entirely reflect the fact that he's okay with the fact that there's nothing wrong with that. So let me explain. So let's start with the pentatonic scale just very briefly. So we all know the pentatonic scale is just a 5-note scale and then you're at the octave. So it's a really easy scale to use because you can basically use this scale over just about any chord progression as long as you're in the right key, and it's going to sound pretty good. But of course, 5 notes is very limiting, and typically we usually stay in the same E string based pentatonic shape. Now, Kirk isn't one to just do this all the time constantly, but he does it a lot, and I don't think there's anything wrong with that. But the problem is Metallica has a huge discography, and if you keep using the same scales and the same tonality and the same guitar effects like the wah, it shouldn't be a surprise that some people, especially your super fans, get a little bit annoyed or a little bit tired of the same sort of sounding solos. So Justin's video basically highlights a Guitar World interview with Kirk, and he talks about a couple of scales, and we're going to kind of dive into them real quick and try to see if he actually knows music theory and he knows how to use these things. So the thing that Kirk says is he knows his modes. So it's not surprising that he brought up modes because theoretically modes are very, very easy to use if you're going by the simple use the same scale but start on another note type thing, and it usually can sound pretty good and no one's gonna look twice or rewind and see if you've actually done the right thing. So when he mentions things like the Hungarian scale or the symmetrical scales on the guitar, that's where I sort of have a problem, because correct me if I'm wrong, but I have not heard a Metallica solo that has either of those scales, and let me explain. So the Hungarian scale is also named double harmonic minor, okay? And that basically means that we use the harmonic minor scale, okay, which is a minor scale with a raised 7th, but you also raise the 4th, so it creates what we call a tritone in the chord progression, okay? And here's the thing about that raised 4th is when you change notes in a scale, especially weird notes like that, it's going to change the chords that go underneath, which basically means that you're going to have some extra weird sounding chords in there, and it can be a little bit difficult if you don't understand the concept of creating chords. So things like the secondary dominant or the augmented 6th chord can be heard in this chord progression because of that raised 4th. Correct me if I'm wrong, but I've never heard an augmented 6th chord in a Metallica song. I've never heard of a secondary dominant chord in a Metallica song. Now, Metallica has a huge discography. I could be missing on stuff, but generally, especially with their hits, you're not going to hear any weird chords, and that's okay. But what I'm saying is that if he brings up those kinds of scales and he knows them and he just chooses not to use them, I would bring up other bands that are kind of similar to Metallica that get brought up a lot whenever you bring up Metallica, like Megadeth, and say, okay, do they use these kinds of things? Yes, they do. Especially Marty Friedman was a huge fan of the Hungarian scale, okay? He did a lot of things with the raised 4th because it sounded really, really cool, really exotic. Things like Holy Wars, you can easily hear that in there. These chord progressions were definitely more spicy than Metallica's for sure, and you had a lot of really interesting chord progressions and riffs that used a lot of weird chords and notes. Now, this doesn't mean that Megadeth is better than Metallica and vice versa, but I just think that it's something to criticize if you bring up certain scales but you've never used them, nor have you had the opportunity to use them. Now, do you have to use that scale over those certain chords? No. Sometimes just using a really spicy note and then resolving it to where it should be is a nice amount of tension and resolution that you can use. But in most of Kirk's solos, we don't really get a lot of tension and resolution. And tension and resolution is kind of what music is structured on. Metallica does use that raised fourth somewhat in their riffs, like Enter Sandman, where he does use that B flat in the key of E minor, and they use the key of E minor on pretty much all their songs at this point. And that's very cool, but I'm talking about more specifically Kirk's guitar solos. So that would have been the perfect time to use the Hungarian scale because we have that raised fourth or flatted fifth. And in turn, the solo was just mostly pentatonic and a couple of basic arpeggios. Now, when he mentions symmetrical scales, all a symmetrical scale on the guitar is basically a scale that reflects the same exact shape going in different spots. And let me explain that real quick. Take the chromatic scale, for example, because that's the easiest one. All you got to do is go up a fret, right? You just have to go up 1/2 step and keep going up 1/2 step. And as long as you know how that looks when you change strings, it's going to be pretty much the same shape going all throughout, right? Same thing with the whole tone scale. That is another symmetrical scale because we are going up in whole steps. It's almost opposite of chromatic, so you're basically skipping a fret. And as long as you know how to change strings with that, it's not going to be an issue. Also, things like the diminished scale or the augmented scale work in this exact same way. Once again, reiterating, I don't know of a lot of Metallica solos that have any of those scales in it, except for sometimes the chromatic scale, but usually when he does chromatics, it's more reflected off the chromaticism in the blues scale, okay? And now, this isn't always the case. Sometimes there are points where he does use more of an actual chromatic scale, but what I'm saying is that I think it's a little bit silly to bring up the fact that he knows the scale, but he just never uses it. But why not use it? Because if you listen to their last single, specifically the solos on all different ones, you can barely tell the difference between any of those solos because they're all the same. Now, once again, I'm going to reiterate, you have to know how to use the scale. It's not just something where you know what the scale looks like. You got to know how to use it and where to use it and when it's appropriate to use it. And I think that's one of the things that maybe Kirk wasn't really thinking about. So let's say the whole tone scale, for example. If you play a whole tone scale over a diminished chord, it's not going to sound super duper great. But if you play a whole tone scale over an augmented chord, it actually sounds pretty all right. And that's one thing that a lot of guitarists need to really think about is if you know the shape, that's great. But if you don't know the theory of when to use that shape, you're kind of screwed. And you should really try to learn how every scale works harmonically. Now, Kirk sort of makes this argument that basically solos shouldn't have to be super fast, they shouldn't be super flashy, and he brings up a lot of, metal elitists who are criticizing him and they think that he should go crazy and play fast and stuff. Who says that? As Justin said, who is actually saying that? Because you have plenty of really awesome guitarists who aren't as flashy, like he brings up someone like Joe Satriani. But the thing is, Joe Satriani is really good at making melodies. And again, if you listen to Metallica's most recent songs and in their solos, where are there any actual melodies in there? It all just sounds like a bunch of blues runs, a bunch of pentatonic runs. And again, if you are looking for that sound and style, that's great. It's music. You are free to do whatever you want. But there is going to be some criticism if all of your stuff is starting to sound the same. And he does bring up the fact that solos should do this. Solos should reflect a vocal melody because that's what a good solo is it reflects the vocal melody because melody is the foundation of music, as Mozart said. But I don't really think that he had a very solid grasp of that when he was writing the solos of his last few singles with Metallica. I'm not saying that Metallica is bad. I think they're tremendous songwriters. I think James Hetfield is a fantastic writer of melody. I actually really like his guitar solos a lot more usually when I hear them because he's very good at picking out melodies. But I just think that some of the things that he said, especially with the music theory aspect and those scales, were just a little bit ridiculous. I think if you listen to more modern metal, you'll kind of realize that modern metal isn't really afraid to take risks with their scales, with their chords, and everything like that. You'll hear a lot more diminished chords in modern metal, like let's say Flesh God Apocalypse. They're masters at using tension and resolution with doing all sorts of spicy chords. Or take Lorna Shore, for example. Who makes better melodies these days than Lorna Shore? They have beautiful melodies. I appreciate Justin bringing this up because I wanted to just kind of talk about the music theory, and I hope that you guys at least took something out of this and you can learn something and learn how to maybe spice things up a little bit, because it's important to not really fall under the trap of sounding the exact same. It's okay to sound similar because you are the musician and you're going to tend to stick to your old habits, but you should at least try to strive to spice things up, especially with your theory and your technique.